All right, so I'm going to finish up by talking about Black Power and chapter 21, of course, deals with Black Power in a more specific way, in a more detailed way than we're able to do. In our discussion last time, we wanted to use the video. I wanted to use the video in particular to get you to think about how folks are going to be responding to, reacting to Black Power at this moment, how scary it is for a number of people, how shocking, but also sort of how people define it differently, how it really signaled a change in the movement. For some, it was the end of the movement, but it's really this tipping point, this important tipping point. Yet the chapter does, I think, a really good job of connecting that period with what came before it and what comes after it. So I do want you to be thinking about both of those things. What is it that leads to Black Power? How does it look similar to things we've seen before? And then how does it connect to today? We mentioned some aspects of how past and present are specifically connected. In this chapter, I think, does a good job of looking at that. Black Power and Black nationalism are connected to things we've seen before. In the very first slide, for example, it's talking about connections to World War II. We keep making this case that, quote-unquote, the 60s connects with much earlier periods, at least going as far back as World War II. So one of the first things they say in the chapter, and want to make us think about, is the connection to World War II and A. Philip Randolph. We talked about A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington, or planned March on Washington that gets called off. What that was showing was kind of self-reliance, self-determination developing much earlier in the 1940s, and not just in the 1960s. What it shows is that Randolph and others realized that African Americans are powerful enough to kind of make their voices heard. So he says, look, we're going to get 100,000 people, and we're going to march on Washington. We're going to embarrass the government in the middle of World War II. That's sort of showing the changes, perhaps, that have occurred since the 19th century and since the early 20th century. And ideas about self-determination and power, right, that later we'll see develop into something like Black Power or Black nationalism. So recognition that you have a certain level of strength, you have a certain level of power. And how should you use that power? These are questions we've been debating all along. Some of them say separatism now maybe is a better strategy. Maybe integration was wrong. Right? Maybe integration was an incorrect goal all along. Maybe we shouldn't be trying to force our way into quote-unquote white society. Maybe we should do like what King Washington said and stay in our own neighborhoods and improve those neighborhoods, control our schools, control businesses, right? Black police force in the Black community. These are a lot of the rhetoric that you hear around Black Power, how some people would define that concept. The Federalist communities rather than trying to integrate into other communities. So separatism as a strategy starts to question integration. And maybe later on down the road, once you improve yourself, once you have economic power, say, maybe then you would try to integrate into American society. A lot of folks say that in the 1960s, late 1960s. But what surprised me is that sounds very much like King Washington. It's like, look, go in your own communities, get a job, improve yourself, and then eventually you'll be able to integrate. So it's interesting how radical that was seen in the late 60s, because the tone of it sounded so different than King Washington. But really, if you break it down, it's not that different from what Washington was advocating. It's not that different than what Marcus Garvey was advocating in the 1920s. Separate businesses, are you trying to integrate into society that is beautiful? These are a lot of the same phrases that you would hear by the late 1960s and early 1970s. We use Malcolm X quite a bit to try to link these connections between past and present. Right? Malcolm X is seen as one of the kind of quintessential Black nationalist figures. Right? He dies the year before Black Power as a term is coined. Right? So he doesn't see that phrase. Yet a lot of what he was talking about fits perfectly within discourses of Black Power and later Black nationalism. He was a member of the Nation of Islam, as we know. The last couple of years of his life, there will be some problems he finds with that and embraces those a different way. This is how he was sort of raised in a sense, and we can think about the significance of the Nation of Islam in African American history and culture. And again, they're thought of as this really radical religious and kind of political organization. organization, but really what they were doing on a certain level has been considered conservative. Starting black businesses. Black men need to clean themselves up. The black family needs to improve itself. And these are very traditional values in a sense. They were going to use those values to ultimately, hopefully, separate from white America, but in terms of a practical application of it, it's really interesting to think how non-different that is from what Booker Washington was talking about 80 years earlier, 90 years earlier, 60 years earlier, whatever it is. The Nation of Islam continues to serve an important role in the African American community, especially if you think of their work among black men in prisons. No organization does more for black men in prison than the Nation of Islam does to this day. So if you think about this kind of continuing significance of a group like this, they again advocate total racial separation. Integration is not going to be their goal. This is part of why Malcolm X would get into trouble and kind of find himself distancing himself from the organization. They had some differences around politics, political views. Really, the main leadership of the Nation of Islam did not want to involve African Americans too closely in American politics. Their view was no one wants to separate from them. Let's not advocate and talk too much about the political scene. Let's not talk about integration or push towards that. Let's sort of separate and be apolitical in a sense. Malcolm finds that he doesn't want to do that or can't do that. So, for example, Malcolm X really gets into trouble around in 1963 when Kennedy gets killed. He's kind of instructed not to say anything about President Kennedy getting assassinated. The leadership of the Nation of Islam kind of knows this. If you say something bad at this point, the country's going to come out against you, blah, blah, blah. And Malcolm X is asked about it, and he says basically Kennedy getting killed was chickens coming home to roost. Famous quote phrase from him about chickens coming home to roost. What he meant is that America had been so violent to people of color here and abroad, right, that ultimately, if you're violent, ultimately that violence comes back to bite you. That violence always ultimately finds its way home. So that's what he said happened to Kennedy. He said, look, you get folks that are used to assassinating black people, pretty soon they might assassinate white people. Pretty kind of practical and common sense and kind of throwing it back in their faces. Really has this major backlash. Malcolm X would get suspended from the nation, I think, for 90 days. It really kind of the beginning of the end for him in the organization. They really went their separate ways over various issues. But Malcolm is a good example of how we might connect previous generations to the Black Power, Black nationalist era, and what comes after it. We talked about how his father was a minister for Garvey. How Malcolm learned a lot of his Black nationalism, perhaps directly from UNIA and Marcus Garvey's organization, many of our we also look at how Malcolm connects to more recent events. You look at 1990s hip-hop, for example, you're constantly hearing references and samples of quotes from Malcolm X, even today. Mark has some quotes from Malcolm X, for example. So there's these really direct connections you can talk about with someone like Malcolm X and his figure, his image, his impact on this period. Malcolm was seen as, again, the most vocal opponent of the civil rights movement. Malcolm, as a black nationalist, will find that he was one very critical white racism, white America, especially early in his career. If you listen to Malcolm X's speeches, especially earlier ones, he's super harsh on whites. Right? He talks about all whites are devils, long hair, blue eyed, devils. Smell like dogs. I mean, he's rough on whites. Some of this he might come to rethink, especially the last couple of years of his life. He reevaluated certain things that he had thought and said earlier. But just as harsh as he is on whites in these speeches, I think what you should find when you listen to any of his speeches or read them is he's just as harsh on African Americans. Black nationalists tend to be pretty harsh on African Americans because they tend to think that African Americans can do something about their problem. If they relied on self-determination, if they were more manly to defend themselves rather than sitting in and not letting themselves be beaten, for example. If they strengthened their own, cleaned up their communities, took care of families, that perhaps they wouldn't be treated in certain ways. And a lot of this stuff, again, goes back much earlier. Marcus Garvey was saying a lot of the same things. saying, it's not just white people's fault, but you allow yourself to be treated a certain way. So it's interesting how a lot of this message will get targeted towards African Americans as well. That blacks need to be more dignified, have more pride in themselves, defend themselves, that men need to be men. These kinds of phrases come out of a lot of these rhetoric. For me personally, what I think is most impressive about Malcolm X is a very complicated figure. We really don't have enough time to do justice to the whole class on Malcolm X time, or the side class. So you could discuss him and his complications for an entire semester. What I like about him, what I think is really significant about him, respect about him, is his ability and willingness to sort of change. I think a lot of us, even still today, are hesitant to change and rethink our earlier thoughts. It's easier just to go along and believe what you've always believed. What I admire about Malcolm is when presented with contrary evidence, he tended to rethink things. So, for example, on his Hajj to Mecca, he has to rethink some things in his own life, in his own beliefs. Early in his career, he asked if he's ever met a positive white person, white people have ever done anything positive for him. He thinks about his own history and he's like, no. Like every white person I've met has acted like a devil. So he traces, for example, there's one of the excerpts of these speeches online. His father getting killed by the plane. Little kid. His mother looks crazy. He's mistreated by the insurance company. He's like, that's another example. He's made fun of in school. Like he's told in school by his teachers that he can't be a lawyer because he's black. Like he's put in the foster care system in the system. Doesn't have good experiences there. Ultimately, he's going to go to prison, so he kind of reflects on the judge. He's like, no, a white person has never done anything before. But then he goes on his pilgrimage to Mecca and he says, wait a second. All of a sudden, he's sitting down praying next to Muslims that were white, as well as all sorts of others. He says, wait a second, I need to rethink this whole all white people of that thing. Doesn't apply to you. So he comes back and he's like, I can't say that anymore. Because it's not true. I have met people that have treated me as an equal, even though their skin seems to be white. That makes him rethink a lot of it. And in many ways, again, he's going to be dead, a year and a half or so after making this film. So we don't know eventually where this issue is. We don't know how far it might have gone. I've seen some black feminist scholars that talk about Malcolm X as perhaps becoming a proto-feminist. After his images and his thoughts about women, probably we can reevaluate that something. So we never know. Right? He's actually moving in some ways towards reconciling with Martin Luther King. Maybe there's a lot of kids see this in some right? We go to see talks of reconcile King, apologize about some of his earlier statements and his about Martin Luther King, Uncle Tom, these kinds of things. Many people argue that they really were converging in a lot of their views. And if they had come together, imagine how powerful a movement like that may have become. So we never know what might have happened with a figure like this. Picture of Malcolm X, very famous, sort of his militancy and sort of challenging way of speaking. He definitely was that. A lot of what we see in this period is a regional movement, right? There's obviously a lot of civil rights activism in the South, since so many African Americans still live in the South at this point. But one thing you should notice is how much of this activism is in other areas. Right? By 1970, about 50% of African Americans have left the South. So by 1970, you have these urban concentrations in the North, cities like New York, Detroit, Chicago, in the West as well. The West is starting to expand. So it's interesting how much of this movement is now national, not just regional. It's not just Birmingham, but it's also Oakland, Harlem. Part of what we looked at, say, with the Robert Kelly Congested Terrain article and some of the other articles, and comparing them with the 60s timeline, is there's an overlap between these various phases of the movement that we've laid out. Right? Legalism, nonviolent direct action, to black power, black nationalism. They don't just follow each other. There is tremendous overlap between them. And they really exist at the same time. Gloria Richardson, talked about in the chapter, is a good example of this. She's a nonviolent activist who who also consider self-defense important. There are other organizations also that may blur this line between nonviolence as a strategy and self-defense. The Deacons of Defense, for example, or the chapter talks about Robert Williams and his organization. So, for example, in North Carolina, you had Robert Williams and others, formerly members of the NAACP, that think maybe the NAACP is quite radical enough. Robert Williams writes a book called Negroes with Guns. And he says, look, yeah, we want to be nonviolent and try to integrate into society, but we're not going to let the Klan kill us. So they say, look, they challenge the Klan at some points. Come out with their shotguns and say the Klan marches are going to be right out here too, making sure perhaps that they don't do anything to other nonviolent activists. So there's a blurring of the line between some of these strategies that we see more and more. A lot of black power, black nationalism, rhetoric is read in terms of gender. We saw a lot of this in the video, black power, white backlash video. How often do they talk about manhood, reclaiming black manhood? And that's an important goal, especially as we've seen historically how much black manhood has been attacked. Not that there's anything negative about that. Yet, and they also are going to consider how maybe taking that too far could be problematic. So, for example, in the Black Panther Party, we have these extreme versions of black manhood. We have this emphasis or this tension put on black men reclaiming family and protecting their women. Right? All that stuff sounds good. What happens when you don't protect by you? What happens when that protection starts to look like domestic violence? So you have a lot of women, for example, black women in the Black Panther Party that say there was a lot of violence in the Black Panther Party towards women and others. Some of them leave the party and say, nah, this is not for me, this is not what I'm fighting for. I'm not going to get free from racism and struggle against that when they can be abused by black men, by people that look like me. So it's really interesting that black power, black nationalism are developing at the very same time as black feminism. I think if you're a black woman in 1967, 68, you're like, okay, I want to join the Black Panther Party and free the race and this and that. But somebody beat you up in that party. Or you're viewed sexually in that party. You're like, this is not for me. That doesn't feel like for me. So I'm not going to leave that. I'm going to go over here to the white feminism movement. Right? The white feminism movement, especially by the early 1970s, is growing in strength, picking up steam. You remember black women come over here, and they're like, wait, this doesn't feel like free to me. White feminism becomes notorious for racism. So you've got, on one hand, some black nationalist organizations that are sexist. Yet on the other hand, you have some white feminist organizations that are racist. But black women are like, dang. It's interesting. You see a lot of the formation of black women's organizations that kind of charting their own course in this period. Black feminism as an idea has been sprouting. We see it in a number of ways. The tipping point, especially for black women. A lot of the problems of the period get blamed on black women, so it's not surprising that you see these things develop in the way that they do. It's a really important era. Another aspect you see coming out of this connection of power and nationalism is an internationalizing of the movement. Again, Malcolm X is useful in this respect as an example. People are thinking of this as an international human rights movement, not just an American civil rights movement. Malcolm X was always saying, I'm not a civil rights activist. So he's in favor of human rights, in favor of freeing all people, not just in the U.S., but around the world. So a lot of folks start to see African American struggles here as connected to the struggles of people all over the world. The struggles of African nations that are starting to gain their independence in this period. Right? In 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. This is all occurring at the exact same time as the one hitting Malcolm X. Right? So a lot of folks are saying this is the same thing. It's an international movement here and abroad. In fact, as early as the 50s, Malcolm X goes to the Bandung Conference, sits down with representatives from various Latin American, Asian, and African nations. They look at how do we free ourselves. They start looking at themselves as occupying similar positions with colonialism abroad and racism in the United States. Malcolm X comes up with the idea that, you know what, this could be a useful strategy. Malcolm X thinks in part that civil rights is misguided because civil rights activists are asking the government for help. Malcolm X is saying the government is the problem. If you are asking the government to change the government, what sense does that make? For example, police brutality. Police brutality is an issue then, and obviously it's still an issue now. If you get beat up by the police, what is your response? Oh, the police. That's common sense. Yet you can see how someone might be nervous as they get beaten up by the police to dial 911. What if you call the police and the same guy came and just beat you up? A lot of activists in this period start phrases like, well, who protects us from you? Right? So Malcolm says, how are you going to appeal to the government to change the government? He said that's part of the problem with civil rights, is they're asking the very oppressors to stop oppressing them. So he comes up with an idea of using this kind of international reform. He says, you know what, we should sue the United States government before the world court. We should take the U.S. government abroad and sue it in front of the world court. And all these other nations should help in that. This could be particularly embarrassing for the United States and its government. Right in the middle of the Cold War, right, the U.S. is trying to argue that it's a superior government, economic system, freedom, and democracy that was better than Russia, the Soviet Union, communism, right? We want all these other nations to follow our model rather than follow the Soviet model. Yet, the Soviets, as they point out, you have all these second-class citizens in your country. Who wants to follow that? If you're dominant in 1957, get this independence. If you want to follow the U.S. model, black people can't vote. Right, so Russia is using this against the United States. So it could look really bad if Malcolm X would be successful and sue the American government for this world court. Some people say this is what Malcolm X is truly radical, truly dangerous. Not necessarily early on when some about it. Right? I see that to be kind of dismissed. But when he threatens to sue the U.S. government in front of the world court, some people say that's when he can be truly dangerous. He's making all these alliances with leaders of other nations. In the last year of his life, Malcolm X starts an organization called the Organization of African American Unity, Afro-American Unity. It was based on a similar organization on the African continent, the Organization of African Unity. So he's making all these alliances, all these connections that could be formidable connections if they were allowed to develop. Malcolm X considered himself a revolutionary. He thought that civil rights activists were not revolutionary, they were reformers. There's a distinction, a different kind of definition between a reformer and a revolutionary. I'll give you an example. This is how he would have seen it. A reformer thinks that there's a problem with the American system, but it can be fixed. The problem with the system, but it can be fixed. So let's use some practical examples. You got a car, right? Your car is about 4 or 5 years old. Warranty just ran out. As soon as the warranty runs out, stuff starts breaking. Right? These new tires, new oil pan, minor things. You're not going to throw the car away, right? You're going to new tires, a couple $100 in there. The oil change is fixed up. Right? You can reform, you can make it work better. The reformer thinks the same thing about the U.S. government. Right? Fundamentally, the system is good. Right? There's some good things in place that you can take advantage of. For example, the Constitution. Martin Luther King is constantly quoting from the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights. These are great things. Right? Individual freedom of speech, press, assembly. Couldn't have a civil rights movement without those rights. The right to meet and march, so right? He says, look, there's not a problem with the system. It's just a problem with people. We don't apply those rights equally. Yeah, people have the right to vote legally. We just don't let people of color vote. We just discriminate against people of color and women. So what we need to do is use those same institutions and open them up equally to everyone. So that's what King is fighting for. So look, we should all have access to this American freedom, American democracy. That's a reform. We can just reform the system and make it work better. Don't throw it all out. Just make it work better. Malcolm X is going Alex did not consider himself a reformer. He considered himself a revolutionary. And this is where that question of violence sometimes came up. He says, how many revolutions historically have you seen without violence? Sometimes he said violence might be necessary to free yourself. But the main difference is, I think, more philosophical. He says, look, the Constitution was written when people that look like you and me were slaves, and justified slavery. The Bill of Rights and all that was not intended for us. We weren't citizens. So how can we use documents that were written to discriminate against you to try to free yourself? But you can't. You got to throw it all out and start a revolution. You got to throw it all out and change it. Whether that's violent or not violent, maybe it's another question. But you got to change it all. You got to throw it out the baby with the bathwater that goes away. So this is one of the main differences you would see between himself and among the reformer versus revolution. He says this, using the car example, he says, look, you drive a bus, you better take yourself down to the dealership, get your new car. This car is not worth it. It's not just a matter of putting the tires on it, your engine, your transmission shot, your windshield is cracked. You're going to spend more fixing it than you would buying a new one. You need a new system. So think about that distinction between reform and revolution. And how, say, Malcolm and Martin may epitomize both of those two things. But again, there's a tremendous change, especially in the last few years of his life. It comes back and he's still committed to say that he's willing to work with any group or organization or individual that is working for the benefit of all people. Black, white, didn't matter. That was a very different Malcolm X than we saw pre-1963. So who knows where he may have ended up ultimately? Who knows where he may have ended up ultimately? He's killed. He's killed in 65, right before Black Power as the term is coined. But in many ways, his rhetoric fits perfectly into kind of the idea of Black Power. He's consistently talking about poor housing conditions, poor education conditions, unemployment as problems, not just racial problems, but almost class-based problems. Again, we see Stokely Carmichael make the famous speech where he coined the term, I was trying to give you credit for it, kind of putting a label on a feeling, really, a spirit at this time, sort of tipping point in the movement at that point. Some folks, again, think this is a great thing. Some folks think it's a bad thing. This is kind of the end of the movement for them. He's the head of SNCC, and eventually SNCC is interesting because SNCC actually joins with the Black Panther Party. They unite for a time. So Carmichael becomes a member of both for a minute. Now, eventually there's a falling out, and they don't really work out. But it's interesting how you see this transformation throughout this movement. The Panthers, we kind of talked about them. Obviously, the chapter does more in terms of details. Another very complicated organization. Can't really do it justice in a couple of class periods. Very complex. The Black Panthers consider themselves revolutionary naturalists. Again, these are distinctions between reform and revolution. They were in favor of revolution. They thought there was a fundamental problem with the American system. They thought this problem with the American system, specifically capitalism, the economic system, caused it to discriminate against most of its citizens. Who was discriminated against? African Americans, yes. Poor people, including poor whites, yes. Women. If you start adding up all these people, that's probably 89% of the population. He thought that's a systematic problem, systemic, institutional problem. And they thought communism was a better system. Socialism was a better system. Everybody shared everything equally. So they're heavily influenced by ideas and theories of socialism. So this is why you hear the Black Panthers talking so much about, say, Vietnam War. Vietnam War is a capitalist continent. Other countries, they saw themselves as connected to the Vietnamese people and such. So the Panthers are interesting in terms of their revolutionary nationalism. Yet a lot of what they were asking for were basic human rights. You see the 10-point platform for the Black Panther Party, put a copy of their 10-point platform, 10 things they really wanted, put a copy of that Black also one of the readings talks about the rules of the Panther Party. If you take a look at that, you might be surprised at some of the rules and how conservative they might seem. Like there were rules like you can't be drinking while you're working for the party, no drug use among party members, no cursing. Now again, these were rules that were not always followed. Part of the downfall of the Panthers, according to many of their members, is going to be a lot of illegal drugs, especially by the 1970s. Heroin pickup, a lot of them get involved in that, although they were not supposed to. Not supposed to commit violence against other Panthers or against members of the community. Remember, you're trying to free the community. Why would you commit violence against the community? But the Panthers are really interesting. They took this revolutionary nationalism seriously. What do I mean by that? They weren't just about race. They weren't just about race. These were the example of history. They were about freeing the community. Give me an example. The Boyette boycott. Boyette boycott. The liquor store owner named Boyette, asking for Boyette. He has a liquor store, I think it's over in Philadelphia. Was seen as particularly problematic. He has a liquor store, they only sell this most poisonous liquor. All the things that, that are poisoning the community in the image of, in the vision of the Panthers, opinion of the Panthers. He's kind of like a leech in the community. He's there, he's making all this money, he's poisoning people, he's not doing anything back to the community. Boyette. So the Panthers say, you know what, we're going to boycott you. We're going to boycott your business, exploiting the community, right? Capitalist business, exploiting us as proletariat, blah, blah, blah. That makes theoretical sense that if you're a revolutionary nationalist, this is not the thing you're against. Now, the surprising twist to this Boyette boycott is Boyette was after her. So Boyette's like, wait a second, I'm a black business owner, it's not like black power. I'm trying to make some money here, blah, blah. What you want? Panthers like, don't care what color you're from. You're exploiting and destroying the community. You got to go. Panthers would do things like beat up drug dealers. They live out religion on the community. It's really interesting to think about how they saw themselves in relationship to the community. Now, again, a lot of this stuff ultimately is going to fall apart. But they saw themselves as revolutionary nationalism. It wasn't just about sort of race. It wasn't just that about race. Picture Huey Newton, founder of the party, pretty famous picture. One of the background is actually more famous than he's sitting in the big chair. Again, remember, he brings a lot of prominence to the organization, especially after the shootout with police. His movement, he's put in jail, tried, murdered. A lot of folks start paying attention to the Panther Party during this whole pre-Huey movement era. Yeah, they started local, that's what they started. Eventually, you see branches spread up all over the country. There was one in D.C., one of the D.C. kids from my class, Baltimore, New York, various areas of New York, Los Angeles have major branches. So yeah, they ended up having branches in various places. They never saw themselves as really like having millions of members. That wasn't really their vision. They saw themselves as a vanguard organization, as they said. They were going to be small in number. They were going to sort of educate and inspire millions of people to follow the ideas. They never saw themselves as like a peace organization with like 5 million members. In terms of numbers, they were never as big as like peace organization. But in terms of their impact, you could argue that they were particularly significant. How long were they around? That's a good question. They started in 66. Their heyday was really the late 60s. Into the early 70s, they are still around. But it's in the book. I've seen some numbers that talk about maybe a quarter to a third of the people, especially now in the police. By the mid 70s, a lot of them on drugs. Huey Newton was killed in a shootout of a drug deal or something in 1984. But there's still some around, I think, by the late 70s. There's a new Black Panther Party that's out now, different than this one. They use that name, they have some similar rhetoric and such. But yeah, probably by the too. Some of the members do survive, and some of them end up surprising. The other founder of the Human Newton is that Bobby Seale. Human Newton Bobby Seale, founder organization. Bobby Seale is kind of a conservative Republican figure now, for Christianity as a minister too. So he's kind of helped me with progression. Now, revolutionary nationalist position, maybe Martin Luther King, something like that. You know, people are still around, but they're doing very different things. But a lot of them actually use their life in this period, and that's part of it. That's the end of it. End of them as a threat, you can say. Fred Hampton's a good example of this. So he's this rising 21-year-old leader of the Chicago Panther Party. He's seen as particularly dangerous. We were focused on him as a figure that after Martin Luther King was killed in '68, is charismatic enough to perhaps become this national leader. Remember, the FBI, the counterintelligence program, puts out this notice that says they do not want another national figure, national civil rights figure being developed. It's too dangerous. A lot of folks think Fred Hampton had a chance to become that, and gets killed in assassinated, basically shot in his house. A lot of what happened during this era, the Panthers in particular, are this complicated group. Now, again, they consider themselves revolutionary nationalists. They were in favor of revolution, armed revolution if necessary, to overthrow the government and oppression, this sort of thing. Very political in that sense. They had enemies. They had other organizations that had a different vision as well. One of their main enemies were a group of cultural nationalists, the revolutionary nationalists. They didn't really get along with cultural nationalists. Cultural nationalism is kind of looking at culture. Culture as particularly important. So whereas the Panthers were saying we need to change capitalism and readjust class relationships and whatnot, organization US were prominent cultural nationalists. If you saw us, they wore African garb, the guys had shaved heads, we had natural hair, right? Very sort of cultural, good example of cultural nationalism. The leader of the US organization, which was one of the main enemies of the Panthers, stood for United Slaves, US stood for United Slaves. This guy, Malana Horizon, was his name. He's still around. He's like I said, out in California, actually, out his own. Harambe is probably best known today as the creator of Kwanzaa. You ever heard of Kwanzaa? Kwanzaa is an African American derived holiday. It starts the day after Christmas. It's for 7 days. It celebrates the seven principles of Afrocentric in their view. So again, think about this as an example of cultural nationalism. You're kind of getting away from American culture, right? You're kind of doing things that connect it back to Africa, in a sense. Kwanzaa starts in this period, the 60s, early 70s, when he developed it. The Packers looked at that and they're like, that's ridiculous. You talk about some Kwanzaa, some Kwanzaa present, we're talking about freedom. So these groups really start to butt heads in the late 60s, early 70s, especially in cities where they both had major presences like LA. LA was one of the big centers for the US organization as well, so they really started to have conflict. Ultimately, violence erupts between these two organizations. Now, again, some of these claims are banned by government forces. I told you about that counterintelligence program. FBI's COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program is what it stood for. That was a program designed to disrupt, to minimize the power of groups like the Panthers. They thought the Panthers were very dangerous, so they took various steps, various tactics to disrupt their activities. So they, not only arrested Panther members all the time, harassed them, in fact, some folks talk about being held over balconies by their feet, trying to threaten, some folks were shot. But they also did sneaky things, like I said before, write letters to kind of fan the flames of violence. So, for example, we had this tension between the US organization and the Panthers in LA. And the guy wrote letters to Black Panther members and said, when I see you on the street on Tuesday, good. Sign these letters, Ron Frank, mail it to the Panthers. So the Panthers get these letters, they're like, okay. So when we see them, it's on. Make sure you have your blood, make sure your blood will take your safety off. See each other in the street, die. And this is sort of documented stuff that was done by the counterintelligence program. In 1969, there was a fatal shooting on the UCLA campus where I went to school. So it's interesting. The person I was teaching this class, I was teaching a building called Campbell Hall. And I'm reading this stuff in my preparation for class, and I didn't know some of this stuff. And it's like, yeah, there's a shooting on the UCLA campus in Campbell Hall. Right? I thought it was emails. So literally said, it's the same thing over there. It ended up being the same building that we were learning about this stuff. And what happened was there was a Black student union being formed on campus. And there was an argument within two organizations over who's going to kind of be divided to control that organization or control ESU. And a couple of families died, got shot in the building and died on the campus. Yeah, some people blame this counterintelligence program, especially for kind of fanning flames of a lot of this stuff. But they did have different visions of what freedom looked like, revolutionary nationalism versus cultural nationalism. You mentioned Muhammad Ali as well, right? He's come out against the Vietnam War, right? He would say, famously, that no Vietnam would call me, why would I fight them, right? He's going to lose his license for this, have his title stripped from him for several years for the prime of his career. Real time. Right, but his mission was, look, I'm not fighting a war that is not right. That he can use his religious beliefs not to have to do so. He's connected to the Nation of Islam, so obviously that had a major impact at the time. A lot of the stuff we keep talking about, as you see, has to do with young people. Youth. Young folks, right, are always at the center of revolution. Young people tend to be the engine. Right? Maybe there's some reasons for that. Young people tend to be less patient. Right? They don't feel like wait too long for stuff sometimes. Let's go. Hurry up. Talking too much. Take my 10 minutes. But also, in some respects, that's necessary. I think about somebody that's 80 years old in 1960. They might think, we've accomplished some things. It's all changed and stuff, right? And that is used to, lynchings have gone down. Whereas a 20-year-old is like, I can't grow. Not a good place to live. Right? So your perspective changes sometimes based on your age and what you've been through. But it's interesting that a lot of what we end up talking about is about young people. Some of the young people like Carmichael come to look at King as being too old, disconnected from the community. Even though he's only 39 when he dies, I hope look at him in the eyes. That's the whole generation, the whole way of doing things. Students in particular play major roles in this era. The anti-Vietnam War, the anti-war movement is strongly developing in this period. Some people see connections between the two. Students play a central role in the anti-war movement. That makes sense, right? Student age folks tend to be the ones that have to fight these wars. It's mostly old politicians that send countries to war, but it's young people that tend to fight them. So a lot of young people are like, we're not in favor of this, especially as the Vietnam War dragged on and continued into a very divisive war at home. Some people think civil wars when they're running over this war. Not just among black people, among white students. White students see a lot of their friends go and never come back to Vietnam. Thousands of them die. Very contradictory, controversial conflict. And so you see this play out on college campuses in this era. There are several shooting massacres that happen on college campuses, not just on black folks, but on white students as well, because they're protesting against the war. More and more blacks at white institutions, but also some of these on the bottom. You see a couple of examples. Orangeburg, South Carolina, and Penn State is very famous. Massacre that happened in 1978, Penn State University, a very white institution in Ohio. White students are protesting the war, and they get shot. National Guard opens up on them. So this makes obviously national news, and it's kind of of shows you the tensions in the society at this time, particularly around issues of freedom, whether this was justified war or not. All these issues are there. So again, this era really is complicated in a lot of ways and connects to a lot of different things. One of the things that connects to are issues of education and culture. Black is beautiful, natural hair, afros, African style, braiding. A lot of these things are connected to this notion that black is beautiful. We tend to think of it as a negative thing, but we rethink that in this era of black power and black nationalism. Courses in black history are really first proposed in this era. Most of the ethnic studies centers that developed in colleges, African American studies, Asian American studies, Chicano studies, feminist studies, women's studies programs, most of them developed in the late 60s, early 70s. Didn't exist before that. And what's interesting, places like California, San Francisco State, for example, we have alliances of people of color across racial lines for some of these goals. For example, in 1968, San Francisco State University, there's a major student strike for ethnic studies. So you had black students, Chicano, Latino students, Asian American students, all protesting together for the creation of African American studies classes, courses in Asian American history. They felt they should be represented as well. And these are the development of these programs, hiring of black faculty members, professors, thank goodness. Really is an interesting development of how schools are going to change. Schools are going to change in terms of what they think is important to teach. Class like this would have existed from 1970, 1968, 1969. So much of this gets institutionalized. Culture as well comes into this. Important piece of culture. Affirmative action. Affirmative action is developed in 1964. Lyndon Johnson uses that phrase, affirmative action. What President Johnson meant was that we've been changing laws by 1964 now for years. Proper support in 1954, Civil Rights Act 1964. So, in some ways, Johnson is saying we're not really taking steps to make equality a reality. He says we need to take affirmative steps, affirmative action, in order to really change how people's lives are experienced. If we're really going to have equality, we need to take action. Government has to actually do something. So this is really the origin of the term. And the set of programs that develop around affirmative action. Affirmative action has been controversial. People think it only has to do with black people getting to school. Not true. Really, any kind of program where government or other institutions involve themselves to try to ensure equality of opportunity in various ways. So, for example, we have traditionally white institutions, colleges, right, that had not been accepting of African Americans, people of color, women. What steps do you take to try to diversify your campus? Now, the steps you take may vary. Give you an example. At UCLA, when I first applied there were 38 different factors that went into deciding if you were going to be accepted at college. 38 different things. Like I said, I thought it was GPA and SAT. No, that's only two of them. There are all kinds of things that one might look at to get a sense of whether they think it's very subjective. There are always way more applications than there are spots. 40,000 applications and 4,000 spots. So what affirmative action does is it says, yeah, let's look at a variety of factors to see who's going to come here. The idea is that diversity is a good thing. The idea is that, especially at a state school, you want to have as diverse a population as possible to try to ensure better education. If you're educating people to live in a diverse world, shouldn't they experience someone that doesn't have those same experiences? For example, if Boone State only was rich black men, you didn't get the same experience that you had a variety of folks, some men, some women, some from the South, some Christians, some Muslims, some African students. If you have conversations with those folks, aren't you learning more about what the world might actually be like? Perhaps. And that's kind of the idea of this notion that diversity is a diversity is a good thing. Diversity can be all types of diversity, not just racial diversity, class, region, sexuality, religious background, or your first generation college student, you play a sport, you play a musical instrument. These are some of the 38 categories that one went into UCLA's decision. So, for example, this is an example of how arbitrary this might be. UCLA and UC Berkeley seem the two best schools in the UC system. I got into both UCLA and UC Berkeley. I did not get into UC San Diego. I'm from San Diego. Some people told me, well, part of the reason why they probably wanted to get regional diversity. It doesn't make sense legally and logically to go maybe two of the best that they were down here. I was crushed, but I didn't get it. I was the first rejection I got back. I was a little out of my money to get the people. Now, not only did they tell me no, they said, you might want to try to go over high school guidance counselor said, you should try to join an army. So again, it's interesting to think about the variety of factors involved. And affirmative action is a program that's supposed to do that. It's supposed to try to ensure diversity and provide opportunities that didn't necessarily happen. Now again, we think this will be education, but it's applied to business. People are bidding on construction contracts in the past, and so we have to be involved in that lab construction. It's what we did or different need, these type of things. Sometimes they get used for that. Largest affirmative action program, some say the GI Bill, after World War II, that helped create the middle class in this country. And it's mostly white soldiers that had access to that, but black soldiers couldn't have access to it. So it could involve any variety of programs, especially if you're targeting certain needs. Major beneficiaries of affirmative action who benefits the most? Women. Women have changed the way college campuses look. As we know now, most college campuses are majority women. Pretty much everywhere, right? That was not the case before the 1970s. It was not the case. Colleges were hostile to women, but they were accepted. Very few women were on college campuses. I may have told you my story about UCLA. My first year there, my first African American history class was in math and science. It was right across campus, where I thought it should be. But I had a history class in the math building. I went to this math science building, and like I said, had a friend of mine, went to the restroom. She went to the ladies' room, I was in the room. Came out, she's making this face like, what's up? That's what you're doing. She's like, no, I went to the ladies' room and they were girls. Like, you want to run that? Like, no, I said, ladies. Restroom, they're here. Wow, it's already urinals. We're not women there, but that building was different, especially in the math and sciences. So all they did in the 1990s was change the sign on the bathroom. They had two bathrooms, let's make this one lady. Both men. They didn't change the bathroom, they just changed the sign. Affirmative action led to fundamental changes on these campuses, where all of a sudden, UCLA is a majority women now. That was not the case before 1970. Were women stupid before 1970? No. They all of a sudden got smart. In 1971, they go to college now. No. Society change allowed them certain opportunities. Affirmative action was one of the main policies that provided that. You can see how a lot of this comes out of the civil rights era and out of these notions. Last part of the chapter talks about culture a little bit more. There is an explosion of cultural production in this era called the Black Arts Movement. Black Arts Movement. Very similar to what we saw in the 1920s with the Harlem Renaissance. Black artists focusing on various things, power and whatnot. Very much connected to notions of black power, blackness beautiful, some major figures involved there. Maya Angelou's been from out of this era, of course, although she predates it as well. Mary Brock, the famous poet who just died a couple years ago. He's known as Leroy Jones. He changes his name to Mary Brock. Divorces his white wife. There's a black woman, says I can't be married to her. feminist movement. That was his own thing. Not everybody does that, of course. But for him, it was that serious. So this is very much connected to this notion of black power, black nationalism, this black arts movement. Black people, we kind of already talked about some of that stuff. Other arts, they mentioned some various artists that are still prominent in this era. Blaxploitation films is an interesting one. Blaxploitation as a Hollywood genre. The creation of certain movies with black characters, especially kind of strong black men and black women. Blaxploitation, Shaft, all these kinds of things. They're in the 1970s. And many people see this as negative, right? As usually drug dealers, shooting folks, and talking crazy, and pimping, that kind of stuff. But some folks say it's a horrible movie. Other folks say, look, you're seeing black male figures that are not sandals. Walks around and beats people up. She's serious. So in some respects, it's a really interesting cultural kind of manifestation of some of this stuff. Women's rights, talk about how, especially black feminism is going to explode out of this. If you think about women having problems with black power, black women having problems with black power in some ways, and having problems with white feminism in some ways, and then they begin to carve out their own path. We see a lot of the production that we still know to this day. Color Purple, for example, is a book. Alice Walker wins a Pulitzer Prize for writing The Color Purple, so it becomes a very successful movie. And award for it. Think about what that book's about. It's about seeing the main character, a black woman, or her sister get separated, and they're trying to kind of reconnect. See what goes through a lot. She's married to Danny Glover, Mr. was his character, right? Married to this guy that's abusive, essentially. You see Color Purple, you should. It's a great play. Probably don't have a couple tears. It's sad in many ways. On TV the other day. But she's out, living through depression, 1940, all this kind of stuff, but she's dealing with violence, domestic abuse. She's dealing with this controlling man, a black man. So in many ways, that's not just about white racism, it's also about other things that black women deal with. Some people criticize that movie and say it was bashing black men. Some people think that black feminists are bashing black men. That's not always the case. Not always the case. Sometimes it's just about articulating your own sense of freedom. Much of this develops around, again, this period. In that Black Power, White Backlash video, I mentioned Mr. Daniel Moynihan, Senator Moynihan. We didn't see him, I don't think, in the part that we saw, but he comes out with his famous Moynihan report. Right? He's charged with writing up a report that talks about what is wrong with this black community. He says that it's really the problem with the black family. Black family has collapsed. The reason it's collapsed is because men are not men anymore, and black women are too dominant. Right? Young black women are all loud, and don't listen to nobody. Basically, the same stereotypes that he was saying. He says the fundamental source of weakness is the family. He says black female-headed households are to blame for what he called, quote-unquote, tangle of pathology in the black community. Tangle of pathology. So again, in some ways it seems blaming black women for what's going on with black women. Some of his recommendations were that black men need to become men again. So he recommended, one of his recommendations was that they join the military. Upstanding, essential responsibility, take care of their family, protect their women, these kinds of sort of traditional rhetoric that you hear. And there's going to be a response to that. Michelle Wallace writes a book in response to that. So Alice Walker's work, notions of black feminism, or womanism. A number of black women's organizations are going to be founded out of this. Again, there are several directions that we see things develop, particularly feminist organizations. Some of the women that we're still familiar with, Eleanor Holmes Norton's here in D.C., she's a civil rights era lawyer, still active. Shirley Chisholm, black woman once for president in 1972. So women are doing things. This is before Jesse Jackson runs in 84, and obviously long before Barack Obama's going to win. It's a picture of Shirley Chisholm here. And so the civil rights movement in some ways is successful. Right? You get the chance some people's minds, yet there are going to be things that people think are not successful in this era. We still have race riots like Watts in 1965. We still have problems of unemployment in class. Between 1949 and 1964, unemployment rate is double that of whites. Some people say, okay, the civil rights movement worked for breaking down certain racial barriers, but the barriers of class have remained. And in fact, statistically, the black middle class has grown since the 1960s, but so has the black poverty rate. More black people below the poverty line now than there were then. There's actually more of a divide within the African American community. So some people say, is that success? Some people raise that question. Some people think about it. Again, some of the same issues that we've seen recently in the news, right? We're trying to figure out why folks may riot. Some of the same questions were asked about Watts in 65 or Baltimore in 68, Newark and Detroit in 66. Crowded, overcrowded areas, poor housing, poor education, school system, low health care. I saw the reporter in Baltimore talking about why can't I find a grocery store where I can get fresh fruit in this neighborhood. So that this idea of services not being kind of equal, poverty generally, police brutality, opportunities of injury. A lot of these same issues were prevalent, were kind of kicking off riots and rebellions and such. Then, and perhaps still to this day. At the same time, there are some changes. New black political power is one that gets referenced quite often. Again, people living outside the U.S. in major cities perhaps now are a stronger political force. Now maybe the mayor has to listen to you if you have 50,000 black members in Detroit or Harlem or D.C. You may even be able to elect a mayor. Cities like Chicago, Cleveland, Atlanta elect mayors by the 1970s because they now can do so. So it's interesting to think about the transition and the kind of translation of a lot of these things into what we now recognize as common. What we now recognize as kind of common sense. I want you to think about the connections between the past and the present with some of this stuff. Do me a favor, you need to take out a blank piece of paper. Don't worry, you're not taking it for that. Blank piece of paper. You need to do some multitasking for me, so I only got a few minutes left. So you got to do a couple things simultaneously. I'm going to have you fill out evaluations here in a second. They're anonymous. They're almost got the evaluations that you fill out. You're going to need volunteers here that can take these forward to the district department main office, because I'm not allowed to be in the room while you're doing it. I'm not allowed to touch them.